that out here. I found a couple of things that I'd like to correct or at least make sure are included. Item 1 is on number 5, the RTA budget presentation. I think it's important that we note that I believe it was Mr. Medini that mentioned TMC does not make a recommendation on the budget. My understanding is that is not our role, and I think it's important that we say that there. Next item on item 7, the third paragraph, Mr. Ortega confirmed that is correct. However, I also said that there's only 1.8 million in the account, and that somehow we'll have to make up that difference. And there's no guarantee beyond that 1.8 million that we have. The next paragraph, I think it states that staff did not have any suggested motion. I think we need to make it clear that this was agendized as an informational item as opposed to not making a motion, because it sounds like we didn't take action when we were requested to. I think that's important that we note there, as well as the last sentence where it says the TMC did not take action because it was not agendized accordingly. On item 8, on the last paragraph, I think it's important that we talk about the discussion was in the context of all remaining RTA items, not as well as all remaining. I think it's in the context of the recommendation that was made, but it needs to be in the context of all remaining. And that might just be being picky with regard to the language, but I think it's important that we outline that. So those are my comments on the meeting summary. Would the motion maker accept those?
I have no issue. I think every bit of what you said is accurate. So
With the second, is it okay
Yes.
with the second?
Okay.
All right. Further discussion?
Mr. Chair, if I may.
May.
Item 7 was agendized as an action item. The recommendation in the staff memo was for TMC to consider any recommendations that they would like to make. So I would like to make sure that's on the record that item 7 was agendized as an action item.
Okay. So corrected. Thank you. Any other comments from anyone?
Mr. Chair, this is Sam. I've got a comment.
That one was a recommendation. That's my mistake. The downtown use was recommended as a discussion
as a
item.
discussion.
And I apologize. That was
Okay.
mine. So it's a
Yep.
good catch there, Farhad. Thank you. Any other comments or questions, thoughts?
Mr. Chair, this is Sam Credio on Zoom.
Go ahead, Sam.
There was under item 3, this was the in reference to the audit. I believe that Mr. Lewick had stated there was an error in the funding amounts for some of the projects listed. And I believe that you had asked that those be rectified in an addendum or an errata. And I didn't see that included in the meeting summary.
Thank you, Mr. Credio. I think it was page 39, as I recall, Mr. Lewick. If my memory serves me correct. You had found an error, I think, in one of the funding or 2 of the funding items. If there's questions, just go back and listen to the tape on that. Okay, other discussions or comments on that? Hearing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. So that we will move on to item 3, project scope reduction request, Mr. DeGrood.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Oh, actually, Mike, we're going.
Perfect. Don't wait for dinner.
Okay, all right, very good. We are considering some scope reductions, or wish to bring before you the scope reduction requests again for further discussion. As you know, we have some guidance here in terms of the board authority and direction. Ultimately, it's the board's decision for how they wish to carry forth the implementation and compliance with the voter mandated plan. The board did indicate that they would like to identify and move a number of current RTA projects to RTA Next for voter consideration, and moving projects with significant changes are consistent with RTA statutes and our fiduciary responsibility. In terms of the process, as it relates to the reductions, this shows kind of a flow chart of how or the decision tree, if you will, for scope reduction requests. Once they're submitted and reviewed by the staff and the TMC, a recommendation is made. Board action then comes. They either deny it and retain the original scope, or they can approve the recommendation. If they approve the recommendation for the scope reduction, then they have a choice. If it's significant, they can direct it either to the CAC or back directly for an election. It can be included in the RTA next or move forward independent of that. And then if it succeeds, then the plan is changed. If it fails, we revert back to the original scope. If it's not significant in their minds, then they could just move straight to implementation of the scope reduction. Those are their choices. In terms of project scope reductions, we've got two that we have clearly identified as being requested. Those are RTA 13, the First Avenue Ina Road to Orange Grove Road project, and as well as the First Avenue River to Grant Road projects. Both of those have been reviewed formally by the RTA Project Review Task Force. We've also had some discussions, although no formal request to consider reducing Houghton Road north of Speedway Boulevard, and consider looking at what the traffic volumes are and whether or not there's a basis for reducing 22nd Street between Keno and I-10. Those are, at this point in time, we have not evaluated, nor has the Project Review Task Force, but those are potential scope reductions. The task force, as I mentioned, did look at RTA 13 and 14, and they felt that the current number of travel lanes that are in the road prism would be sufficient to carry future traffic, it provided that additional intersection and access and control improvements occur. They did note that the floodplain improvements and costs need to be identified, and those will need to be dealt with as we move forward with a project. And both projects are ideal for consideration by the board for RTA next. And with that, it concludes my summary of what's taken place thus far, and tee it up for your discussion.
Thank you, Mr. DeGroot. I appreciate it. Since both of the two projects that you listed, 22nd Street, RTA 19 and RTA 32, Houghton Road North, have not been formally requested or suggested. And I don't know that the task force has looked at those at all. Is that correct?
They have not.
I'd like to suggest we take those off the table for discussion at least now, because they've not been formally requested or formally reviewed. That's just my suggestion based on that, so we don't burn up time discussing those at this point, unless you see a reason for us to.
Mr. Chair, the only thought I had on this is I know that there was some discussion at the last meeting about potentially bringing forward a ballot question sooner rather than with RTA next. And if we're looking at multiples of those, that should be something that we think about before we move down that path.
Mike? It's Mary.
Go ahead, Mary. And by the way, I think Sam's hand is still up. Mary, go ahead.
Oh, no, Sam, go ahead.
Did you have another comment, Sam?
I did, Mike. I had a couple questions on the flow chart. If we could go back to that.
Sure. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, so my first question is, Jim, is this flow chart just to visually illustrate the decision-making process, or was this flow chart developed through either RTA board action or TMC action? I just wanted to know the history behind this flow chart. And the second is, can you define what significant means? I think you mentioned that if the RTA board in their minds deem the change is significant, recommending it for RTA next. And I would just like to know what that definition is of significant changes. Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Sure.
So,
Thanks, Mr. Chair, Mr. Cudio. This is something that we've put together to help assist in moving forward with these items. This is not board policy. This is what we would recommend. I can tell you that there is no definition of significant. That is going to be a decision of the boards. And perhaps Mr. Mogimi has some further comments on that.
No, just to add to what you said, as part of the task force review process, there were questions about the process, so that's why this flow chart was developed to visually demonstrate the next steps. And as Jim just mentioned, the ultimate decision is made by the board.
thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mary.
Thanks, Mike. I agree, Mike, with your suggestion to take off those two projects. And here's why. I think if we are even considering bringing something to voters sooner rather than later, it needs to be done sooner rather than later. And that would basically rule out the possibility of something potentially being placed on the November ballot. And in which case, then we're getting so close to RTA next that those projects can simply move into the other. The ones that are before us, that have been brought before us, are kind of ready to move. And so I also concur. Let's kind of focus our conversation on those, and let's see if it's still, if it makes sense for us to at least offer that as a recommendation for the PAG board that they consider.
Okay, if there's no objection, then we won't, we will not review RTA 19 or 32 at this point until there comes
Mr.
more-
Chair, just
more formal
if I may.
review. More formal review. Mr. Mulgeen.
Yeah, just a reminder that at the last TMC meeting, the request was made to bring all the projects back for the conversation. So that's why it's agendized in that fashion, that you have all the projects for reductions, all the projects for expansion, and then all the other remaining projects. So I just want to remind everyone that was at the request of the committee to bring all of them back.
So, Mr. Mulgeen, so this item is specific to those four. And are you saying that that's all that we have left to deliver, are those four projects?
So
Because
the
the request was actually to look at the potential for moving the First Avenue projects. And I think there was a discussion of us on Sunset as well, but having those discussions in the context of delivery of the program as a whole. And that was really the conversation, which I think is agenda item 5. If I'm not mistaken.
So again, if I may, the thought process was to categorize these as we have in the past. Reduction in scope is broken down separately, expansion is separate, and then the remaining projects, again, it was at the committee's request to let's look at all of them and not just the one or two projects. So that's why it's agendas the way it is. It's obviously at the committee's pleasure how you want to handle it, but the thought process was that this way you have all the projects in front of you.
So I understand, I guess the conversation last meeting of the committee was to have a more robust discussion about delivery of the program and how the potential delay of the First Avenue projects would fit into that, and not do one-off. And so it is piecemeal the way it's presented here, at least the way I see it. I think we should look at the entirety of the program, is my gut, just to see how we plan to deliver the program, and whatever recommendation we make would be in that context of the delivery of the entire program. Curtis, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
I do. Thanks, Mike. I had one comment on the use of the term significant. I think that there is a definition of significant change in the governing statutes. In Title 48, I guess it is. There's a pretty clear definition of the word significant. And the other was just, I was asked the other day about the Broadway project and the change in scope on that. And I'm just kind of curious of how the approval of the revision on Broadway fits in and dovetails in with the flow chart. I'm sure it does, but I know there were some public meetings on Broadway under the umbrella of the RTA, which have not been held for the two First Avenue projects. So if we could just discuss that a bit. Thanks.
Sure. If I may, I'll take a stab, and Jim, feel free to add. Broadway went through a very extensive process. It went through a design concept report, extensive public process, and roughly after 5 years of reviewing that project, it went through a board approval, and at the time, board did not consider that as a significant change. Therefore, they were able to go ahead and implement the scope change on Broadway. So it's consistent with this flow chart. So it would follow the flow chart. After determining that it was not a significant change, they did go ahead and approve implementing the scope reduction.
What about the statutory definition? Any of significance? Any comment on that?
Yeah, so at the time, we had that reviewed, and the determination by the board was that it was not significant.
Okay.
I think Mr. DeGreed wants to add something to it. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I just would mention, Mr. Lewick, that you had raised the question of significant in the statute. Significant in the statute refers to element level changes, and it's a financial term or a financial metric. In this case, it's more informally used. Perhaps we could say if warranted, or if we could change that if that's the issue. That is really a choice, though, of the RTA board as to whether or not they wish to refer it back to the voters, or if they feel comfortable with going forward with authorizing the change on their own. In the case of Broadway, that's what they chose to do, following, as Mr. Mogimi mentioned, significant outreach.
Sure. Okay. Well, you might want to consider, as far as the flow chart is concerned, changing the terminology, because the shrewd observers out there will recognize there is a definition in the statute, and it may come into play at some point.
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, sure.
Just a question, Jim or Farhad. The public information effort for Broadway was exclusively done by the city of Tucson, or did the RTA also participate in that?
So just thank you for the question. So just as a reminder, once a project is selected, there is an agreement between the lead agency and RTA. Then through that process, it's a collaborative effort. RTA is involved and the lead agency is involved. So in case of Broadway, we had a citizens committee that was very much involved in development of the DCR and the outreach, as well as RTA and the city at the time. I think most of you were around. I think that took roughly about 5 years to go through that process and finally reach that decision to go ahead and reduce the scope.
So for sake of comparison, a similar process hasn't been undertaken on First Avenue in the city.
Yeah, this project hasn't even begun to do a design concept report or any involvement with our citizens committees to develop the concept even for the design. So yes, this is early on in the process.
I guess my question is, could it not be done? I mean, we as a project review task force felt that we had enough information from traffic forecasts, et cetera, to determine whether the scope change was justifiable. Could we not undertake a similar public information process with that project today?
Of course, again, I think that was the city's desire to potentially do the needs analysis and not go through the whole DCR process. So that's, I think, the intent was to try not to do 5 years of studies and maybe make that decision earlier in the process, I believe.
So let me maybe add a little bit of context here. We didn't wake up one day and say, hey, let's reduce the scope on First Avenue. There was a request to look at potential scope changes within the program that's left to help make up for some of the shortfall, and there's any opportunity for us to reduce those costs. So we went down that path, and not only did we do all of the engineering piece, we went through pretty exhaustive public comment as well. I did not know or understand that there was another process or parallel process that needed to happen. Fine, we can do that. But at the end of the day, it was really at the request of this group really to look for ways to save dollars, ultimately to deliver the program. And I would suggest if there is an opportunity and we didn't follow a step because we didn't know or weren't told, then we certainly should embark on that. I would hope that we aren't going to wait 5 years. I think Broadway was to some level an anomaly, but I would suggest that we look at that. And that would probably include the RTA, I'm sorry, the First Avenue piece north of, that's my gut at this point. Because again, we're trying to be responsive to how do we deliver the program. And if there's another opportunity, then we should explore that at least at this point. So that we're comparing apples to apples on the potential delay of the project. I do have a comment, and this goes back to the task force recommendations. Actually, it's the facts or findings. Item 6 specifically says it fulfills this request, fulfills all of the performance and functionalities of the original project and appropriately reflects the changes in the forecast system demand. So if it fulfills all the performance and functionalities, then I would question whether it's a significant scope change. That's my question, I guess, as we go through this process, because then there's a memo from the executive director as well saying this is a significant scope change, which is not what the task force said. Task force said it was not. And correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just reading from your notes in the task force. The recommendation of the task force is to move it into RTA next. I understand that, but I also see up above in it's item number 6 that does not say that. It actually says it meets the performance and functionalities of the project as originally thought through.
Yeah, so if I may, that's again, the definition of significance is up to the board to make that determination. From a technical perspective, we agree with the task force. From a technical perspective, we believe that the functionality is going to be met. By definition, the difference between the scopes are really what we're talking about. Would that be considered a different scope? And is it a significant change from the scope? But again, the technical side, we support the task force's recommendation. We believe that the information that they had reviewed was good, solid information. And that's one of the reasons that we felt that it was appropriate to move it on to the TMC for a conversation. And again, that's definitely up to this committee to decide if you have sufficient technical information or not, or if now this becomes a policy decision for the board.
But I think for the committee, if in fact we focus on the technical aspects, I think we agree on the technical aspects. The policy conversation is really what we're questioning here, which is moving it into RTA next versus trying to accomplish it today or within the program. Yeah.
All of these decisions appear to be made before the board action. So I've got a simple question. You indicated that the city has done a lot of engineering and public outreach to come to this decision. Is it all organized to the point where there might be some kind of new report submitted that would allow people and allow this committee to better make that decision of the significance of the changes? Can you assemble this into basically a second DCR, revised DCR, to be then submitted and reviewed for significance? And if that were the case, is there a time frame opportunity where this could be moved into the final design process and actually be delivered within that time frame of the current RTA program?
I think that the short answer is yes, and absolutely. Why would we not? I think that Farhad mentioned that we resisted the DCR. I don't know, we resisted. Again, we were going down the path of trying to reduce scope based on the program. And so the conversation is, if there is an opportunity to look at more formally taking this to the board with a different recommendation, and I would suggest we do that. And we not do it over 5 years, but we do it post haste. Do it immediately. That would be my suggestion. And I don't know that we need to get into the detail because I think we're still up at the higher level, but I do think this group needs to weigh in at some point on the interpretation of flood control on projects. Because the last paragraph, or excuse me, number 5 under the recommendation of the task force talks about flood control improvements that are integral components of the project, but that have benefit outside of the project. I'm good with that, but I think that where we need to really focus is what is necessary to deliver the project. And that needs to be a conversation that we have, and we're starting to split hairs on that. It just needs to be thought through and really come up with something that makes sense. I don't have an issue necessarily saying, hey, there's value outside of that footprint. We can have that discussion. But ultimately, I think we have to focus on what is the opportunity to deliver the program or that project so that it doesn't get flooded when it rains. And otherwise, we're basically going to put a dip crossing in and call it good. And that's not the intent. So I think we just need to talk through that. I don't want to bog this down now because that's detail, but it is included in the recommendations. And I just thought I'd point that out as something that we should discuss. My suggestion is that we kick it back and have it go through the more formal, John, what did you call it?
Well,
Whatever.
the recommendation from the task force uses the words voting public input. Now, that's perhaps the issue for the board to wrestle with, right? What represents voting public? Is it what the city's already done, or maybe some additional broader based kind of public involvement process?
And my, forgive me, obviously, my first meeting, and so I'm new and just trying to understand a lot of these things. One of the reasons that I think the county project we looked at, concurring with the committee's recommendation that these projects go to RTA next, is for part of that discussion about what's the public input. I look at these and say, these are projects that are underneath RTA and underneath the scope of this organization. And even if it is, for example, a county project, it's still within RTA next, which is why I've seen therefore the public outreach of public participation, if you will, or opinion gathering comes under the auspices of that organization rather than simply what might occur within each of these separate jurisdictions. Each of us may have a different standard or a different way in which we gather public input, or that we define what voter input is. And that might not be the same for the other jurisdictions or for the other communities, which is why we got to figure out what's the going, Jesse, for the overall governance of this organization. And so my concern that even if we've done our own, we've not done it in accordance with overall project or the guidelines of RTA, and why I would recommend that we move forward with the committee's recommendation of looking at these with public input and going into RTA next.
I would disagree in terms of the RTA next. I don't disagree about the RTA doing the public involvement for the scope change. I have no issue with that. I think that's fine. If we want to take those separate, we can do that. But I would suggest that on the RTA, or excuse me, on the First Avenue piece that's within the city limits, City of Tucson, that we look at going back through the public process that has been outlined here. We were not guided that way, and so I think we just need to do it. I'm totally good with that. I think we've done a lot of outreach, but certainly I appreciate your comments, Jan, that there should be consistency in how we do that, and I'm totally fine with that. Anybody have any other comments?
Hey, Mike, this is Sam. I have my hand up. Just wanted to touch on the public outreach the city did do on this project. We did a regional survey as part of our feasibility study. We also met with businesses along the corridor. And so I just wanted to elaborate on some of that, the extensive public outreach you mentioned. And then the project review task force letter did state that overall the public did support the reduced cross section as the preferred alternative. So just putting a little context behind what that public outreach was and the result of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Go ahead, Curtis.
Great, thank you, Mike. Well, it seems to me that there's four possible outcomes of this. One is that the project somehow goes ahead with the 6-lane cross section. And then the other three choices are modifications of approval for the 4-lane. One is to administratively approve the change. The second is to have the voters approve a change sometime between now and whenever the RTA next election is. And the third choice is to have this at the RTA next, which I would assume would be sometime in early 2026. To me, it's we're going to thrash this around for another 5 meetings. To me, it's almost to the point where some kind of an informative staff memo could proceed up to the RTA board and let them make a decision, because each of these options has pros and cons associated with it. The early election thing, kind of expedites and gets will hopefully get the voter approval of reduced cross section. Moving it out to a vote that's several years away delays things. And I do agree with the city of Tucson in its letter that there is, at least from a public safety and traffic safety standpoint, some urgency in getting improvements in First Avenue. So, we want to get things right and we don't want to delay. And I do think it's possible to get a memo together if the project review task force can help with that. But to me, it's a decision that we're probably not going to make at the TMC, and we probably need to have a multiple choice option for the RTA board. So I'm just floating that out there. That's not a motion. It's just something to discuss.
Thoughts or comments on Curtis's? Go ahead, Rod.
I like the 4 options that were laid out there. I do think that we're not there yet. All of this hinges on the definition of significance. And if the definition of significance is when we've done this historically in the past, such as on the Broadway project, that was all redefined as part of a revisit of the DCR. We're going out to the public to give the board an opportunity to make the determination of whether it was significant or not. We haven't even done that process yet. And I think moving forward at this point would skip the opportunity to do that process and to even bring a complete package forward. So I'm of the opinion of revisiting and letting the city develop that opportunity and then moving it forward.
Other comments? Go ahead, Terry.
I also like what Curtis recommended there. And I do agree with Rod. In my personal opinion, as I look at it, it seems significant to me. You go from 6 lanes down to 4 lanes. I'm not comfortable without some sort of public outreach, some sort of public input that, yeah, we're in agreement with this, we agree with what you're doing. It may totally make sense. It may accomplish exactly what was set to be accomplished. But if somebody's coming to my house and telling me they're going to put, we agree that they're going to put 10 solar panels on my house, if they come back and say, hey, we only put 5 because we could do it with 5, should have really checked with me before you done that, right? So I just kind of feel like there's an element of this that we haven't got to yet, just as Rod said. And I think we do need to go through those steps, whatever those are. And I think we need to hear, what options are on the table for us.
Mike, I think the point about gathering input and developing more detail is well taken. So I said before in this setting that the ask from TMC to the jurisdictions to find those scope reduction options came in September, and then we submitted a response in October. So from the county's perspective on First Avenue and also on Silverbell, that northern segment of Silverbell, we didn't do nearly the work that you did. And I think that in your responding to the call for scope reductions, you were already well into evaluating the options on First Avenue. And I think that our position in saying, right, more time is needed and more public input is needed is because we didn't have that running start on providing input back to this body when the ask was made for scope reduction. So, if that's going to be a path taken, it gives us all an opportunity. And I know in the case of Silverbell, we're, working in close conversation with the town of Marana. We all felt that this needs more time to mature to get to a point where we even have the ability to ask the public, which option do you like best? Right now, we don't have any of the deep detail that you've already developed on First Avenue for that northern segment of First Avenue from Orange Grove, Dinah, and then certainly the Silverbell piece. We've got an indication. We look just strictly at the projected traffic volumes. So I think that piece that Rod mentions is very important. If something's going to get advanced to the voters sooner than RTA next, there has to be more detail on whatever goes. And if that's decided that only the city's First Avenue project is mature enough with information or is a short distance from being there, then so be it. If those others, right, require too much lift to get there and then puts a drag on everything that it extends the time frame, we've got to be willing to separate these things out and not say, hey, it's a one size fits all on how we approach it, my opinion.
Good thoughts. What I would suggest, and as we're contemplating this, I do see a couple of questions. I'll come to you all in a minute. Is that we do it in the context of the program, which was really the conversation we had last time. It's how does this work for the entirety of the program? And I don't think it's good to do one-offs, quite frankly. Even if it is the city's piece, I think that could be problematic for us from a region standpoint, because then it's a one-off. Is it an RTA ask or is it a city ask? And then I think we start to maybe split hairs, and that might be problematic for the voters. I see a couple of questions. Jim, thanks for your patience. You're up, and then Sam, you're on deck.
Sure. I guess just a couple of comments and a suggestion. Just Mike, relating to what you just mentioned about understanding the where we are in the program and what we really want to identify, I think, is what are our priorities for what we can accomplish with the remaining RTA program and what needs to move forward into RTA next. I think in the package that was sent out, there's the cost to complete list. I think that gives us a really good idea of which projects we're going to need to make decisions on. Which ones do we truly feel are high priority and we want to continue and we want to move forward, and which do we want to move to RTA next? And then my other comment is regarding the public outreach. I think it's pretty clear. Everybody agrees we would like additional public outreach on all of these projects. Specifically, we've been talking about the city's First Avenue project. I think we need to do that sooner rather than later for a couple of reasons. One, I think the RTA board is going to want to have that type of information and a little bit of assurance that whatever decision they make, if they decide to move forward with a project, that they feel comfortable in doing so. Because it's not I think in the recommendation from the task force, there are two questions asked. Technical, does it meet the functionality of what we're hoping for? And then should we move to RTA next? I think the board takes care of the latter. But I also think if this goes to the voters in November, we're still going to have some sort of an outreach effort so the voters clearly understand what changes are being recommended to them. If it just shows up on a ballot, and I know it won't be that simple, I don't think we're gonna do the voters the correct service of giving them the information. So my suggestion is, I think the city has done some excellent outreach with respect to First Avenue, maybe specific to that project, although we could include other projects. But I think maybe we need to have several public meetings scheduled over the next several months to specifically get additional feedback from the broader general public on First Avenue within the city section.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jim. Or go ahead, Sam. Excuse me.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And great segue on a Jim's last comment is that I just want to make sure we have clarity on what that public process looks like moving forward, if that's the direction we're headed. So that way we get into a situation where we have provided the RTA board with as much information as they can to make a decision. Because as you've mentioned, we've done a lot of public outreach already. So I just want to make sure we know what the context is of additional public outreach moving forward, so that we're absolutely clear on what it is we need to deliver so the RTA board can make the best decision possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Curtis, did you have your hand up? I thought I saw it come up.
No.
Okay, my mistake. What's your pleasure? What are you all thinking? Anybody, Jim, you outlined a pretty good way of stating it. You want to make that in the form of a motion?
Let's see what I'm trying to. I'm trying to think of what our intent is for this. We have an action item associated with this item, correct?
This item is listed as a potential action item, and the recommended action is acceptance of the task force recommendation. But I think you outlined task force recommendation plus, not specific to the RTA next, but the public participation is what I think I heard from it, which is consistent with what both Terry and Rod said.
Okay. Right. So I would move that the TMC accept the recommendations of the task force on the RTA projects 13 and 14 with respect to the technical changes, the scope reductions of those. However, or include also in that motion that the RTA/city move forward with additional public outreach, specifically pertaining to RTA project number 14 and potentially RTA project number 13, depending upon what the Pima County's purview is.
And what I
So I've got a motion with a potential.
just a friendly amendment, perhaps, that what I would suggest is if we're going to go ahead with the public participation project, that it be included for both projects.
And I would take a step further, maybe just, are you saying Silver Bell and, or just North First?
If I'm
Just North First first. I just want to make sure we're all clear on that.
Yeah, I think if I can, Chairman, I think Silver Bell's in a different state. I mean, we
Yeah.
really don't
13
have
and 14.
nearly the information to have an informed public conversation, in my opinion, on Silver Bell as of this point.
So for public, and before I ask for a second on that, Jim, I think that the public participation is the RTA guided public participation, and for lack of better definition, similar, if not the same as what we did on Broadway. Whatever that process is what we should be doing.
But it'd be led by RTA.
Yeah, led by RTA, so we don't paint ourselves. And yeah, so that would be my suggestion. So that would be the motion. Is that clear to you, Jim? Are you comfortable with that? Okay.
Yes, I agree.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
A motion and a second. Further discussion on that?
Mike, just real quick. So these additional public outreach processes, I'm trying to wrap my head around these projects as well, but are there additional costs associated with going through that type of process? And if there are, so that we're managing those expectations on the front end, are those covered by RTA, by the city? I mean, how are those costs being borne? Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, I'll attempt to answer that.
Sure.
So as part of the project development process, RTA obviously has funding allocated for that. And if the board chooses to proceed with kind of a hybrid approach before the project development process starts, that would be eligible as well. So we'll have to have that conversation with the board at the time and decide whether this is a full DCR and public involvement process, or it's a more of a hybrid approach.
So Farhad, that would be staff's recommendation, is that RTA assume those expenses to go through that process if that's the board's desire?
Yes, that's our approach on all of our TA projects, to make sure that we have public input and public outreach as part of the development of the project. Yes.
So I have a clarification on that. Farhad, you said that the board will make this decision, so.
Well, we still need board, yeah, we still need authorization from the board to decide how to proceed. And as Shane just mentioned, obviously we need to develop a budget for that.
So this is a recommendation.
This is a recommendation to the board to proceed with additional public outreach and obtain more input before we come back and proceed.
Sam, I think Sam and then Kurt.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So if I understand correctly, Jim's motion includes accepting the reports from the project task force. And I would just like to point out that at the last TMC meeting, we talked about the project review task force primary role was to do a technical review of these projects. And so I have a problem with us accepting the reports with task force recommendation number 3, which is recommending that the project be included on the forthcoming RTA next ballot, since that's an RTA board decision, not a task force or TMC decision. So I would like to ask that that be struck from the draft reports before we accept it.
Just to comment on that, Mr. Chair, TMC is a policy committee, obviously a technical committee, and a subcommittee or a task force of TMC is also under the same mission to provide policy and technical review. We agree that the focus of the task force was mostly on technical review, but they did agree that from a policy perspective and acknowledge that that's still board's decision, and staff recommendation is that that is the board's decision, and it would be consistent with the conversations the task force has been having and the board to make sure that that's something that they recognize that it's ultimately the board's decision.
Thank you for that comment, but I think, Jim, if I'm correct, your intent was not to include item 3, is that correct?
That's correct. To approve the scope reductions only.
Okay, got it. And I would, let's see, Kurt, I'll get to you in a sec. I would also suggest on item 5 that is that flood control piece. I'm okay with the language generally that's included in that recommendation, but I do think that going forward, we need to have more of a conversation around flood control components or elements. I think we call them elements. So I would just make sure that still remains a piece that is of importance. Go ahead, Curtis.
Okay, two questions. Assuming that the RTA board authorizes some additional, somewhat regional public involvement on the First Avenue project or projects, would the results of the public involvement process then come back to the TMC and go to the board, or would they go directly to the board? And that's one question for discussion or comment. The other is, would you anticipate involvement from the Technical Management Committee, particularly the Project Review Task Force, in the public meetings? Typically, those are led by an agency with all kinds of discussion. And if you're anticipating the task force being involved in that, let us know. I think we'd be glad to help, but let us know.
Very good. So the first question, Jim or Farhad, do you all want to take that?
So again, if Mr. Luke, if I understood the question was the extent of the public involvement, that's yet to be determined. We'll develop a scope. Obviously, who is willing and able to participate and support. We welcome everybody's support. And then the question of bringing it back to TMC first and then back to the board, that's at your pleasure. We can include that in the recommendation that come back to TMC first, but up to you all.
Yeah, I would prefer that, doing that just for some consistency's sake.
Curtis, would you offer that as an amendment to the motion?
Yes, that's a friendly amendment to Jim Shane's motion.
Are you okay with that, Jim, as a friendly amendment? Terry,
I am.
in a second.
I am.
All right, so the motion maker and the second are okay with that as a friendly amendment. So we'll come back to TMC. Sam, did I call on you already? Do you have another comment?
Oh, I had one more question. It came out of the conversation that was just going on. So if I understand correctly, RTA will prepare a scope for the public outreach. It sounds like it'll be more than just the city's First Avenue project. I just want to make sure that the cost for that is not going to come out of the ballot amount for this project, that those costs will be borne by RTA.
No, actually, that would be from the project. Both projects would have to absorb that cost, and that's part of the project development process.
Thank you.
Clarification. Other comments on this? Comments or questions? Hearing none, call for the question. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. So that was item number 3. Wow, we're flying now. All right, and then we go to item 4, which is the project scope expansion request. So, Mr. DeGroote, you're up.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. In terms of project scope expansions, if I can get my screen to move again. Well, while I'm working on trying to get the screen to move, we have 3 requests that we have been considering in terms of project scope expansions. There we go. The first is RTA number 5, Silverbill Road, El Camino del Cerro de Aina. The request that has been fielded is for 3 lanes. The 3-lane project that's been scoped in the RTA plan be expanded to a 4-lane divided roadway section. This is something that has been in discussion for probably the better part of a decade. I know that this is something that was discussed in the original DCR for the very first phase of the project. And it was something that was being talked about with the various jurisdictional entities that have that project passing through it. Second project is RTA 31, Harrison Road, Irvington Road to Golf Links. In the plan, this was one of those projects that, as the plan was being defined back in 2006, it had originally been a larger project, but as the committee was going through the process of trying to make it fit with it, make the desired plan elements fit within the project scope or within the project funding available, that project was originally slated to be taken out of the plan, but was added back in because of the public safety aspect of the all-weather access. That is, they put it back in basically as a 2-lane bridge over the Pantano Wash. The city is requesting that it be expanded to a 4-lane divided roadway with companion bridges. And then RTA 32, which is Houghton Road, Golf Links to 22nd Street, which is in the RTA plan as a 4-lane divided, but is currently in design as a 6-lane divided roadway. Again, this has a long history, goes back to 2010 when it was being discussed as to how it was going to be designed and that it would be augmented in terms of funding. In terms of where we are with RTA next requests, as we have put into the packet for the May 11th meeting, there were requests or letters from both management staff at Pima County and the town of Marana recommending that this project be deferred to RTA next in its expanded form. And RTA 31, Harrison Road, Irvington to Golf Links is already a part of the City of Tucson's RTA Next submittal that was presented to the CAC. In terms of pursuant to statute, locally preferred scope changes must be referred back to the voters unless the incremental cost increases to the scope are covered by the jurisdictions requesting the change. So that, Mr. Chair, is our report, and we have some decisions as to what we want to do with those 3 projects.
Very good. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate that. So the first item, there's 3. The first item is the Silver Bell Road, which I saw the note from you, Terry, and then from you, Jan, as well on that. Any conversation around that from you all? And so that is suggesting moving that to RTA next on that. Okay. Just out of curiosity, is there a need for us to do any kind of public review of that? Or do we just make that call to the board and then move it forward? I'm just thinking about delivery of the program as a whole. And I'm just curious about that, if you all have thought about that.
So, Mr. Chair, as part of the development of the RTA Next, we're going to have very extensive public involvement process as well.
Okay.
So any projects that would be proposed to move to RTA Next would be part of that discussion.
All right. So that would be a recommendation for inclusion of that in RTA Next. Do you want to make that in the form of a motion? We'll take these separately.
Take
That already-
separately or together?
Because it is, yeah, so
I'll go ahead and make the motion that we take both of these Silver Bell projects, the portion in the county and the portion in the town of Marana, and move those to RTA next.
Second.
there's a motion second. Any discussion on that?
But Mr. Chair, just to clarify, the phase of the project includes all 3 entities. So just to be clear, we're talking about the entire final phase of Silver Bell, correct?
That is not my understanding. My understanding that this is from, it's basically the unincorporated area, that segment, as well as the piece that's in Marana. Is that correct?
There's a small portion of it that's also within the city limits. That's a incompleted phase.
And that's from Goree to Camino Cerro?
No, this is just north of Camino del Cerro.
North
It goes
Says
city,
Camino Cerro.
county, Marana, I believe.
So we're talking about the piece that's just north, that's toward the back.
Right.
Mr. Chair, it's about 1,100 feet, Mike, something like that.
I appreciate
I
that. Thank
just
you
want to make sure that we're talking about the entire phase, not within
for that.
jurisdictional
I'm
limits.
okay with that.
Project number 5
Yeah.
in its entirety.
I'm okay with it, because it wouldn't make sense to do 1,100 feet
Right.
and then continue.
So maybe I
Put a
should
big sign
amend
up.
the motion to take project number 5 and push it into RTA next.
That'll provide the clarity, and that's fine. with
So
me.
generally, I'm, from, again, my perspective, good with that. I'm nervous about what that looks like in the context of the whole program, but it's obvious that that one would make sense. I think at this point. So I would be okay with, on my end, from the city Tucson perspective, moving that forward.
Mr. Chair.
Again, go ahead.
The only thing I would like to point out is that if we're talking about the RTA 5 project, there is a phase that's about to go out to bid. And what I would suggest is that we consider it as phase 3 of Silver Bell. The phase between Goree and El Camino del Cerro could bid this year. And
That is not on this. That is not this, though, correct?
that
That's
is not this. That is already scoped as a 4-lane roadway.
So what was your clarification?
I just said it, that rather than it being RTA number 5, that it be phase 3 of RTA number 5.
So amended.
Okay. Goree to Camino Cerro will still be completed. It's still up to bid or going through that
That
process.
is,
We're
that is
talking about
consistent
the
with the,
piece that's north of Camino Cerro, which includes Marana, Pima County, and a portion of the city of Tucson. All right, there's a motion and a second on the floor. In favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries on that. On the Harrison Road, so I'm a little nervous about that one, and just so that we're all clear, that is in the plan as a 2-lane road, 2-lane bridge, as Jim mentioned. It doesn't make sense to build 2 lanes today. It would be better to build 4 lanes. One of the things that we should maybe think about, we have asked that it be moved into RTA or included as a part of RTA Next. really the question is, should we move forward with the delivery of the 2-lane bridge now with the expectation that we add another 2 lanes down the road in RTA next? You understand? I mean, basically what was approved by the voter was a 2-lane bridge. We're suggesting that's probably, well, it's small, so let's go to 4 lanes, makes sense. Have a conversation around RTA next. But part of the discussion, again, delivery of the program, delivery of what we said to the voter, should we go after delivery of the 2-lane bridge with the expectation we come back and add the other 2 lane down the road? I think that's a conversation that's important, because if we could, in essence, go down that path now for delivery of that 2-lane bridge with an expectation that would be expanded. ADOT does that all the time. But Rod?
Build a very wide 2-lane bridge.
I'm good with that. Jim might wrinkle his nose, but I'm good with that. Yeah, good point. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm not necessarily advocating that we move the existing 2-lane into RTA next. I think it's worthy of a thought anyway at this point. That's my 2 cents.
I guess
You wanna add
I guess really a thought process is that that may create a constraint for the, ultimate scope. If the ultimate scope is different, my recommendation would be that if we're going to do that, that include that all in one phase and one project. Otherwise, you create a constraint for the future design.
Here's the other thing we could do, just as a thought, maybe we design it now as 4-lane, try to figure out what that looks like going forward with an expectation that we do the 2-lane. Obviously, that's an incremental cost and is not part of the scope, so we'd have to figure out how to pay for that. But that might be a better use of resource, quite frankly, than just pushing it. And again, I'm really focused on how to deliver the program and stand up in front of the voter and say, hey, we delivered. I guess my suggestion is maybe we should delay that discussion a little bit until we can explore. I'm not opposed to going down a path of is it something we could design so that, as Farhad just mentioned, we don't paint ourselves in a corner by building 2 lanes and then coming back and finding out that we have a match or something like that. It's always a challenge. But I just, again, if there's an opportunity to deliver something there that is functional and makes sense, then we should probably think about doing that with an expectation or understanding of that RTA next discussion. Now, the other thing to think about, if RTA next goes, if the ballot measure goes before RTA 1 is complete, and we've already prepared that, I don't think there's anything that would preclude us from putting dollars together from RTA 1 to RTA next to deliver 4-lane. That's another option. So we go down the path that we're going to deliver the 2-lane with the thought that for sure, the other 2 lanes are in RTA next. So my suggestion is maybe we analyze that a little bit more. Go ahead, Jerry.
I was just going to say, from a cost standpoint, maybe, Rod, you could speak to this, but from a cost standpoint, see, you build 2 lanes, there's a cost for that. And you build 2 lanes later on, there's a significant cost to that, as opposed to build all 4 lanes at one time. So, from a cost standpoint, that seems like a lot of extra money to me.
Maybe the conversation as we go after kind of a phased approach from a design standpoint, so that when I'm hopeful that RTA next conversation happens before RTA 1's done, and then we know we're going to build the whole thing, but it's like an ad alternate. That probably is the only way to make that work, I think.
You would design the 4-lane.
Yeah, that's my gut. And what I'm thinking there, Shane, is, I'll talk to the staff. I haven't talked to Sam about that. I'll probably string it up later, but it seems to make sense that we try to do that now and think about that ultimate section but have the fallback so that in good conscience, we can say, hey, we can deliver that two-lane component.
lot more information. So maybe your initial
Little delay,
suggestion that
little
we
bit.
kick this down the road a little bit, because what all the costs might be in the, to do one versus the other.
Yeah.
I'd just like to see some numbers on
Okay,
that.
so that's fine. Tom, I see your hand, and then Sam.
Yeah, just quickly thinking about voter reaction, potential voter reaction to more money for a project that they already approved. I like the idea of designing it now and building it all at once, both because overall it could be cheaper depending on when you actually build it and how much additional cost has come on board because of inflation. But it does typically save plenty of money to build it all at once, or waste money, if you will, by building it in phases. But I'm more concerned about a voter taking a look at a project and saying, what, they're back here again, asking for even more money than the last time for a project that we already approved. Just a thought.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. Go ahead, Sam.
Thanks, Mike. As you know, this area, this road washes out pretty much every monsoon season where it's impassable. So there certainly would be a thought about building the two-lane bridge now. Today's dollars will likely be less than tomorrow's dollars. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But certainly okay with us looking at how to frame this conversation moving forward. Maybe just a quick discussion on what information do we need to produce to be able to make that decision. Is this something where we need to do some planning or some pre-design to kind of understand the nuances here? So that was just a couple thoughts I had. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Sam. So my suggestion on this is we go down, I like that term, pre-design. So recovering engineer, that's always a good thing, right? But maybe start thinking about what that can look like in terms of that future configuration. And it might be that we come back and say, hey, you know what, we'll move it into a conversation. But Tom's point's a good one and powerful. I mean, we got to be careful about that because people's memories are pretty long on that. So my suggestion would be to delay any action on that at this point until we've had that opportunity to take a look at it. That's my suggestion. Unless someone wants to make a motion, I don't think we need to give any direction on that. We'll just come back. We'll keep that conversation moving on that. Third project was RTA 32, which is Houghton Road from Irvington to 22nd. And the city of Tucson has requested an expansion or increase in the cross section from 4 lanes to 6 lanes. That is true. North of golf links, I believe, is the piece. I think there's a question about the cost. I think the materials say 15 million. I think that might be a little higher than what we're thinking at this point, but we are prepared. We understand the need. It is definitely a capacity issue there, and I understand that. I have no particular issue with that as long as it's clear it's not the entire segment. It's only the segment that was not included in or that was not included in that cross section in RTA 1. And I don't have an issue with the commitment that we would fund that, provided that it's not to the level that's outlined on item 5. We still have some work to do. Go ahead, Jim.
Mr. Chair, just on item 5, that is the current funding gap. It is not what we're saying the cost of the delta is. So that's just the gap in what's currently in the TIP.
I think that gap, thank you, Jim. I think that gap is everything that's south of golf links. I don't think there's any cost. No.
So nice try, though.
Well, I get paid. Yeah. All right. So with those caveats, I think that there's a reinforcement. That's what the rule says. I don't know that we need to do anything more than that's what the rule is, and we're clear on that. I'm not arguing that point at all. I think that's straightforward.
So, Mr. Chair, on those topics, we really want to make sure that everybody understands and there is consensus on incremental cost increases by statute. So I would like a recommendation from the committee to make sure that that is understandable, and moving forward, that is unfortunately a challenge that we're going to have, that if there are any expansions to the scope, we have to identify non-RTA sources to accommodate those scope expansions.
Then I would take issue with the stance or the statement, the city of Tucson is required by statutes to fund the cost of scope increases. I have no issue with the scope of from 4-lane to 6-lane. I already said that, not an issue. But I will continue to challenge some of the interpretations of the scope increases that we've talked about on other projects. So I wouldn't be able to support that. I support committing that on that expansion piece. I'm good with that. But I will not agree that in every case of the opinion of the RTA staff that appears to be a scope increase that I would fund that. I can't.
Mr. Chair, we're talking about just this one item and moving from 4 lanes to 6 lanes.
Okay. It's your pleasure on that. I will state again, I'm good with expansion of the roadway cross section as a design element. And if it's to that specific piece, then I would entertain a motion accordingly.
So moved.
There's a motion. Is there a second? And that is for north of golf links. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Clarify on that motion.
Yes, sir. That's correct.
To that
Second.
motion, the second. Further discussion on that? Hearing none. I'll call for the question. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right, item number 5. And we are moving now. Okay. And again, that's Mr. DeGrooves.
Okay.
Mr. DeGrooves, you are up, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have presented for consideration all the remaining projects. I believe you've got the table. We can go through them individually if that's your pleasure. We do have each of them labeled with their existing TIP funding, and this thing is not working for me again. Okay, there we go. All right, we can go through them individually if that's your pleasure. We have 19, I believe, phases of remaining projects. The first one that we'll talk about, actually, this could be considered 20 phases because in RTA 1, we're showing it as stage 2, I-10 to Dove Mountain. My understanding is that the town is desiring to move forward with stage 2A and 2B. The first is 2A, and that I believe goes from the interchange a distance of approximately 2 miles to the east. And that is the project that is that they believe is funded at this point. And the second phase, or the second part of phase 2, then closes the gap between the phase 2A project and the existing improvements that end west of Community Manana, or I'm sorry, rather Twin Peaks. So there's approximately 3 miles in there in the gap, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Terry, but there's approximately 3-mile gap between the end of phase 2A and the improvements that are already completed. That's fronted on both sides by state lane.
These numbers are different from what we got in the package.
These numbers are updated, and thank you. I appreciate you letting me know that. These numbers will be presented to the RTA board next week. These numbers reflect what is in the what has been approved by the board thus far and what is recommended.
What was this? What did you give us?
Pardon me?
In the packet.
In the packet, that is the earlier version that went to the board in March.
So this is old. That's
Yes, this is newer information. So anyway, moving on, we've got the 2 Silver Bell Road projects. Silver Bell Road, ballot number 5, stage 2. That's the project that's about to go to bid. At this point in time, it's identified as funded. Again, we will probably need to revisit the cost estimates. That's something that that we need to come back to the committee with. These are costs that we presented back in March. We understand things are moving. We don't have a handle yet on that. We're going to be going out to all of our jurisdictional members to ask for updated cost estimates to the extent that they can provide them to us. Some of them they haven't looked at in some time. We'll have to look at updating the cost estimates. Then there's stage 3, which is the project we talked about earlier. Continuing on Sunset. Sunset's now showing as no funding needed because that project has been agreed to. It's been funded. In fact, I believe we're awaiting an invoice from Pima County at this point so that we can complete the funding on that. That will be taken on by Arizona Department of Transportation. Project 13 is the First Avenue Orange Grove to Ina project that we spoke about earlier. Again, the current cost estimate's a little over 11 million. With the original scope, if we reduce it, it'll be probably able to be delivered within the funding that's identified available with on the ballot. First Avenue River to Grant. That project, we're showing a current cost estimate of $138 million for that. There's $74.2 million in the TIP presently, and that's something that again we have a request to reduce. The Union Pacific Railroad at Grant Road, we're currently estimating, or actually the city's currently estimating that at $20 million. The TIP actually has more money than that in it. So that's a project that we can look at. The money that's pledged to it is largely federal. So so we would need to find some federalized projects. If we're moving money off of that, we'll need to find some projects that can absorb that funding that's federal. Grant Road stage 3 to 4, or stages 3 and 4. Basically, they've collapsed the number of phases. So we've got 2 remaining major projects on Grant Road. The first, which is about to go to bid. In fact, I believe it's slated to go to bid this summer. We're currently showing it as a construction cost estimate of approximately $47 million. We've purchased an extensive amount of right-of-way already. This is what we believe it will take to construct it. And right now that is, I believe is a moving number. We know that there's been discussion at the project manager level about that. Right now, the cost estimate we're carrying and the funding that we've got identified they match up. And there is some remaining money within the RTA ballot amount that would be able to be put to phase 5 or stages 5 and 6, which is the next major project. There is the potential for us moving money off of stages 5 and 6 to make sure that we're fully funding stages 3 and 4. Stages 3 and 4, we hope to have go out to bid this summer. So that's something that we'll know fairly quickly about. And that potentially is the next RTA project that will go out to bid. At this point in time, we're flying a little blind in that we have not had any recent bids. The last project that was bid, I believe, was Houghton Road, and that was federalized. Before that, it was the Broadway project that we're now looking at wrapping up. So it's been a while, been almost 2 years or over 2 years since it's been pre-pandemic the last time we saw a competitive bid. So at least of a project of this scale. ADOT may have some more recent commentary that they can offer on project costs, but that's something that we can reach out to our colleagues on. But anyway, continuing on, I think I've hit or discussed both of the Grant Road projects. We have Tucson Boulevard. That is a project I know. Stage 2 is the project that's the viaduct over the railroad. I understand we do have correspondence from the city of Tucson at this point that looks at increasing the cost estimate for that based upon the construction manager at risk comments and estimates that are current. And then there is a third phase of that, which goes from I-10 to Keno. We talked about that as being a potential, but there had been some conversations about whether that could be reduced or not. That was something that we knew that at the time the city was informing us they were going to look at traffic on. We've taken no steps on or no action on that. Moving on to some projects that are shown as fully funded. Aviation, Palo Verde to I-10, Irvington to Irvington Road, basically either side of the Santa Cruz River, and Valencia Road, I-19 to Alvernon. Those projects are identified as federalized. We've already got the Irvington Road project in the tip, and the Arizona Department of Transportation is in the process of getting that project moving. Aviation, Palo Verde to I-10, that's a tranche of funding available for right-of-way acquisition. That has not yet been utilized, and it is federal funds that we've placed there. And finally, Valencia Road, I-19 to Alvernon. The scope on that is very vague. It's access, safety, and intersection improvements that we've identified it as federalized. And that is an out-year project. So that's something we're going to have to work on identifying what the scope of the project is. But I think we've got the ability to build to the budget on that. Valencia Road, Cold to Houghton, that project is moving forward, conceivably could go to bid late this year. That's got a significant impact fee contribution that is on it. There's also a shortage of funding on it, but it is a project that's well into design. Again, as I mentioned, it could go to bid late this year if we resolve the funding issues. 22nd Street, Camino Seco to Houghton. That's a project that has a substantial funding need. It's also one that has pavement conditions that are, I mean, I hear on it regularly from people wanting that improved. It largely due to the pavement condition more so than the need for widening. And then finally, we have the Harrison Road project that we discussed. Houghton Road, we discussed that. There is a phase 7 on that, or a stage 7 and a stage 8. Stage 8 is the one that goes north of the current improvements that end about, I mean, there's a transition in around the 5th Street area, but going north from the completed improvements to Tanque Verde Road, it would be the final phase of that. And there's not funding identified for that other than local impact fees at this point. So we do show the additional need for funding that is associated with the difference on the Downtown Links project. We net it all out. We've got basically about call it close to $300 million worth of additional needs. We've got available revenue that ranges between 176.8 and $218.8 million. Those dollar numbers are down from what you'd seen previously because we've taken out the money we've already pledged to the projects that we said that we've dealt with. So that's the net, or the end product is about the same, looking at a gap between roughly 74 and $116 million. And again, that still does not take into account cost increases that we may be seeing in the project. So this is what we'll be presenting to the RTA board. It also is something that I think gives you an idea of what we could be looking at for potential projects that, you know, if we wish to move things out. So there's some candidates in here. This is the remaining list of projects.
Thoughts or comments, questions for Mr. Reed?
Mr. Chair, if I may just add to that, that last point that Jim made, and that was really the, concern is what is the target? And obviously, the 74 to 117 is potentially the target, but as we continue to have this discussion, that's just the starting point. So I would recommend in a 120 range to 150 range is the target for those possible candidates for moving to RTA next. And that's purely to address the financial overlap between the current RTA and the next RTA. So just want to make sure that everybody is hopefully following the bottom line, is that if there is an overlap, we're looking at that 120 to 150 million dollar range overlap at this time.
That's okay. Did you get the same answer?
No.
No?
Yes.
You
said take out the same project.
You said take it out. Yeah, that seems to be a theme here. I'm just gonna say that out loud. Go ahead, Kurt.
Well, I have a simple question with a difficult answer. Is there a timeline marked up yet for when the vote for RTA Next is going to occur? Are we going to run out the clock on the current RTA for a full 20-year plan? Are we planning on going out at a general election or a special election? Has the board addressed any of that? Because we use the term RTA Next a lot, and we're guilty of that in our project reviews as well. And I think everybody has an assumption of what RTA Next means. I'm just wondering if there's any real specificity to that term at the time. If we want great voter participation, we'll have it on the general election with the presidential election on it. If we go out for a special election, obviously that's a more expensive option. So just any clarification on that will help me out.
Sure, Mr. Chair, I'll be happy to. Feel free to add to that, Jim, if you would. But as you recall, the board established the Citizens Committee back in 2018 to start the process. At the time, the board's goal was to make sure that there is an opportunity to overlap the current plan and the future plan. And at this point, realistically, if there's any overlap, it will be as early as probably 24 and potentially as late as 26. So that's kind of a window of opportunity. But just for reference, June of 26 is when the revenue expires. So obviously the board's goal is to make sure that we go to the voters before that.
Okay, thanks. But nothing definitive at this point, right?
Nothing's been decided at this point. The task was to develop a draft plan. And then once we have a draft plan in hand, then the board will make that decision.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks.
Mike Curtis, go ahead, John.
Yeah, so is the issue here whether we have any other options other than RTA Next funding to complete these? I mean, or are we just saying any that need funding out of this 1920 project list will be considered as part of RTA Next, period?
So, Mr. Chair, Mr. Bernal, we've been exploring all other non-RTA funds, and kudos to some of our partners that have been able to bring in some additional federal funds or even state allocated funds. So definitely we're looking for all sources of funding to be able to finish these projects, and especially if there are any competitive federal grants, we're pursuing those competitive federal grants with partners as well. So anything we can bring to the table helps reduce that 120 range. At this point, this is kind of our snapshot, but hopefully as we get more additional funds from other non-RTA sources, we'll adjust these numbers as well.
Well, it's somewhat related to Curtis's question about timing. Presumably because as I'm understanding where we are with RTA Next, we're about ready to start unveiling a list of projects for review by this group to subsequently go to the CAC. If we're doing that, then should our list not be as complete as possible, including all of these that need money?
Yeah, so
I guess my recommendation would be to keep that range in mind.
Because I think, John, you're hitting exactly the point that I made last time, which is I think it's difficult for us as a committee to review individual requests for moving into RTA Next without this picture. And I think that ultimately, and I'm glad Tom is on, because ultimately that conversation is much broader than just a technical review with a recommendation of that. I think that that's really what's been on it. Now, how we get to that point and how, as Jim mentioned a couple times, those estimates don't include escalations. And I know that last line there, the additional funding request, that's going to be twice that by the time we're done, if not more. And so those are the kinds of things that I think as we're going forward, we've got to be thinking about. Now, how we make those decisions or that recommendation, I don't know. Tom brings up a great point, right? We've already told the voter we're going to do X. And then if we say, well, we're going to do X now, but we need more dollars, that's a very tricky conversation to have, in my opinion. But I think that your point is exactly what I've been trying to say over the last couple of meetings. Where I really focused last time. Farhad, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, again, good addition to the conversation. Again, the response to Mr. Bernal was that we are pursuing any opportunity we can to obviously make up some of these needs. But going back to your point there, I think everyone recognizes that these are dollars above and beyond what was initially committed to the voters, and hopefully that's the recognition of additional cost and additional funding needs. That's why the board has been consistently bringing other funds to the table other than RTA dollars, and this would be, nothing different in this case. Unfortunately, the challenge is that we want to make sure that we get these projects hopefully started and additional funding to complete the projects. Those are all on the programming side of the business. And I think we can manage that. From my perspective, the 150 range is very manageable, especially if RTA Next is part of the solution.
Or the one thing I'll caution you is you said the amounts that were approved by the voter. I think that's part of the story. I think delivery of the program and the projects is what we've got to focus on, because to have an expectation that we've done, we can check the box because we are funding it to the 2006 amount is not delivery of the program. So Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, one of the things I think is worth considering as we're looking at our range of options is, what are we capable of delivering? We're looking at $825 million worth of projects. I don't think the RTA has done more than $60 or $70 million to date in a single year. So that would be over $200 million a year of projects that would have to be delivered. I don't believe that we have the capacity to deliver those. So I think there are definitely some opportunities here to look at deferring some projects. The question is, as you mentioned, what makes the most sense and how do we do it in a way that we can present to the voters.
And I think your next slide there, Jim, was, hopefully trying to frame the conversation as, if you don't mind, advance the slide.
I did have another slide, didn't I?
Yeah. So this is really the framing of the conversation, is that we're hoping to have this dialogue at the TMC level and then ultimately at the board level. But the board has already indicated that they recognize that a number of projects have to move forward. And so the conversation really would be, let's identify which projects and using that $150 million range just as a starting point to be able to make a recommendation to the board. They've already acknowledged that there is a need for it, and we hope that at least the TMC can assist with that recommendation to identify which projects should be considered for moving to RTA Next.
So I'm gonna read from Mayor Winfield's memo to the Regional Council on February 1st. He outlined the motion that was made on January 27th for clarity, and the third bullet point specifically says, provide official board positions for identifying a proposed plan and funding to complete the projects as part of the original RTA plan, and define the specifics of how to address any RTA projects if they are to be moved into RTA Next. So I think that the plan is what you said, John, and what I've been harping on. What is the plan to deliver the program? And if there are pieces that need to be moved, that's based on what Mayor Winfield put out, is the expectation, coming from us. And that's why I get nervous about one-offs. We're going to do First Avenue, we're going to do, I get nervous about that because it needs to be in the context of the overall program. So I think that's where we really need to go, and I think that's what we're supposed to do. Further discussion? Okay, this item was not for recommendation. Thank you, Jim and Fahad, for your comments on those. I would suggest that should be a standing item and be discussed at each of these meetings so we can get an update. Last item on the agenda is adjournment, and I will assume no one objects to that.